The dress clung to my body, its weight pressing down on me, not nearly as heavy though as the fate that now held me captive. The hem of the fabric trailed behind me, sweeping across the plush red carpet with every step I took. Each movement echoed faintly through the vast church hall, a cavernous space that seemed to swallow sound whole. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the soft muffled whispers of the guests seated in the pews. Their voices buzzed like distant bees, a quiet hum that carried an undercurrent of something unspoken. They knew. They all knew this wedding wasn't born of love. It was a transaction, a meticulously crafted deal draped in satin and lace. My eyes drifted upward, locking onto the man standing at the altar, Damien Carter. The name alone conjured images of power and unyielding control. Billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, heir to an empire that spanned continents, and now, my husband. He didn't look at me, not once. His dark suit hugged his frame, stark against his pale skin. His posture was rigid and unyielding, his features sharp, sculpted like cold marble. Beautiful, yes, but devoid of warmth. No flicker of emotion crossed his face, no hesitation, no trace of humanity. He didn't look like a groom swept away by romance, he looked like a man facing a judge's gavel, accepting a sentence with grim resolve. And me? I felt the same way. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with excitement or joy. It was anxiety, raw and jagged, clawing at my insides. Fear twisted through me, mingling with a suffocating dread that whispered the truth I couldn't escape: my life would never be the same again. The whispers around me grew louder as I reached his side, a chorus of curiosity and judgment. I could feel their eyes on me, hundreds of them, piercing through the veil that framed my face. The women of high society, draped in their designer gowns, dissected every detail: the way the dress hugged my silhouette, the faint tremble in my hands, the forced smile on my expression. To them, I was the unwanted bride, a pawn in a game far bigger than myself. The priest's voice cut through the haze, beginning the ceremony with words that felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus on anything but the man beside me. Damien stood like a statue, utterly still, as if I weren't even there. His presence was a void, sucking the air from the space between us. I was nothing to him, an afterthought, a formality. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. Damien Carter, do you take Elizabeth Monroe to be your lawful wedded wife? The silence that followed was unbearable. It stretched on, thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a noose. For one fleeting second, my heart froze. Time slowed to a crawl, and a wild, impossible hope flickered inside me. Maybe he'd refuse. Maybe he'd turn away and set me free from this gilded cage. But then his voice rang out, deep and unwavering. I do. 2 words. Cold. Mechanical. No hint of doubt, no trace of feeling. My chest tightened, a sharp pang slicing through me. It was my turn. My mouth went dry, my tongue heavy as lead. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, running, screaming, tearing off this dress and bolting for the doors. But what would that change? I was a piece on a chessboard, moved by hands far more powerful than mine. When I finally spoke, my voice was small, fragile, barely audible. I do. The exchange of rings came next, sealing our vows with cold metal. Damien took my hand, his touch icy and impersonal. He slipped the band onto my finger with precision, no lingering warmth, no gentle squeeze. Nothing to suggest I was more than a duty to him. His indifference stung, a quiet rejection that settled deep in my bones. The ceremony pressed on, a blur of words and ritual, until the priest's final declaration snapped me back to reality. You may now kiss the bride. My heart lurched. For the first time since I'd walked down that endless aisle, Damien turned to face me. Our eyes met, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. His eyes were dark, bottomless pools of shadow that revealed nothing, no desire, no tenderness, just assessment. He leaned in, his movements deliberate. His lips brushed my cheek, a fleeting, feather-like touch that lasted barely a second. It wasn't a kiss. It was a formality, a checkmark on a list. Then he pulled back, his attention already elsewhere, as if I'd ceased to exist the moment the gesture was done. The reception followed, a whirlwind of clinking glasses and forced smiles. Damien worked the room like the businessman he was, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries with investors, playing the game of power with effortless grace. I stood at his side, silent and ornamental, a pretty accessory in a world I didn't belong to. As the last guests began to filter out, a knot tightened in my throat. The night wasn't over. The part I'd been dreading most loomed ahead, the wedding night. I assumed he'd ignore me, just as he had all day, that he'd retreat into his world of control and leave me to mine. But as we stepped into the sleek black car waiting outside, the air between us shifted. The engine hummed, slicing through the dark city streets, and the silence inside the vehicle grew heavier with every passing second. Damien stared straight ahead, one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on his knee. The gold band on his finger glinted under the streetlights, a symbol of a promise he didn't seem to value. My dress, once a vision of elegance, now felt like a prison. Its layers pressed against my skin, trapping me in a reality I couldn't reshape. I wanted to speak, to shatter the invisible wall between us, but the words wouldn't come. When we reached the penthouse, our new home, a chill raced down my spine. The elevator ride was suffocating, the silence between us oppressive. Damien remained a fortress of composure, his expression unreadable. My chest rose and fell slowly as I fought to stay calm. I knew what came next. The wedding night. My hands grew clammy, my pulse quickening as he unlocked the door to the apartment. The space was stunning, sleek, luxurious, and utterly impersonal. Cold marble floors, minimalist furniture, muted tones. It was a reflection of him, pristine, detached, untouchable. His footsteps echoed as he shrugged off his jacket, tossing it carelessly over a chair. I stood frozen, rooted to the spot, until his voice broke the stillness. "Your room is the second door on the left." My breath hitched. That was it. No harsh words, no demands, just pure Arctic indifference. He didn't want me. And somehow, that hurt more than I had expected. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat refusing to budge as Damien's words hung in the air. "Your room is the second door on the left." So cold. So final. It was as if he'd drawn a line between us, two separate lives, bound by a vow neither of us had wanted. My chest tightened with a strange ache, a mix of relief and something sharper, something I couldn't name. He didn't want me here. Didn't want me near him. And yet, that rejection gnawed at me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I took a hesitant step forward, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The sound felt too loud in the stillness, too real in this sterile, luxurious prison. I wanted to say something. Anything. To pierce the armor of his indifference. But what could I say to a man who'd made it clear I was nothing more than an obligation? Then, "That's it." My voice came out weaker than I'd intended, trembling slightly as it broke the silence. Damien paused for a moment. I thought he'd ignore me entirely, let my question dissolve into the void between us. But then he turned slowly, deliberately, and his eyes met mine. They were pure darkness, deep, unreadable, and sharp enough to cut. He studied me, his gaze lingering longer than it had all day. It wasn't warmth. I saw there, not even curiosity, just a cold, calculating assessment, as if he were trying to figure out why I dared to speak. Then a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't kind. It wasn't amused. It was icy, devoid of any real emotion. "What did you expect?" he asked, his tone low and edged with something that made my stomach twist. The question hit me like a slap. What had I expected? A flicker of connection? A hint that this marriage meant something to him? I'd been a fool to hope for anything at all. Heat crept up my neck, a flush of humiliation burning my skin. He didn't care. He didn't see me as a wife or even as a woman, just a burden he'd been saddled with, a clause and a contract he couldn't escape. But then something shifted inside me. If he didn't want me, why should I stand here silently begging for his attention? Why should I let his apathy dictate how I felt? I straightened my spine, lifting my chin as I crossed my arms over my chest. Nothing, I lied, forcing my voice to steady. I expected nothing. I turned on my heel, determined to walk away with at least a shred of dignity intact. My footsteps echoed as I headed toward the room he'd assigned me, each one a small rebellion against the weight pressing down on my heart. I wouldn't let him see how much his words stung. I wouldn't give him that power. But then his voice stopped me cold. "Good girl." The words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they sliced through the air like a blade. My feet froze mid-step, rooted to the floor as a rush of heat flooded my body. It wasn't the phrase itself that struck me. It was the way he said it, low, dangerous, tinged with something that wasn't mockery or indifference, but a deliberate provocation. A test. I turned my head, glancing back at him over my shoulder. He hadn't moved, but his eyes, they weren't cold anymore. They were sharp, focused, locked on me with an intensity that made the air feel electric. For the first time that night, I realized I might have misjudged him. Maybe Damon Carter wasn't as detached as he seemed. Maybe he'd been watching me all along, waiting to see what I'd do. My breath caught in my throat. The space between us crackled with something unspoken, something alive. I wasn't free of him, not by a long shot. And deep down, I knew I never would be. The bedroom door loomed ahead, and I forced myself to keep moving. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed it open, stepping into a space that was as breathtaking as it was isolating. The room was massive, far too grand for someone who felt so small in that moment. A king-sized bed dominated the center, draped in crisp white linens that looked untouched, almost clinical. Dark wood furniture gleamed under the soft glow of a minimalist chandelier, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sprawling view of the city skyline, lights twinkling like stars I couldn't reach. I let out a shaky breath, resting my hands on the edge of the sleek dresser. The mirror above it reflected a woman I barely recognized, wide-eyed, flushed, still wrapped in the delicate lace of her wedding gown. He didn't want me. I should have been relieved. I should have welcomed the distance, the solitude. But I wasn't. "Good girl" echoed in my mind, replaying in that lethal velvet tone. What had he meant? Was it a taunt, a warning, or a challenge? My fingers tightened against the wood, my pulse racing as I tried to push the thought away. It was nothing. He was nothing. This marriage was nothing. I reached up, carefully undoing the clasps of my dress. The fabric slid down my shoulders, pooling at my feet in a cascade of white lace and silk. Beneath it, I wore a thin satin slip, its cool touch a stark contrast to the heat simmering under my skin. I stepped out of the gown, leaving it behind like a shed skin, and crossed the room to the bed. The sheets were icy against my legs as I slipped beneath them, pulling the covers up to my chin. I closed my eyes, willing my mind to quiet, my heart to slow. This was how the night would end, alone, untouched, forgotten. That was what I wanted, wasn't it? But then the door creaked open. My breath faltered. The sound was subtle, barely audible, but it sent a jolt through my entire body. I lay still, every muscle tensing as the faint thud of footsteps reached my ears, slow, deliberate, heavy with intent. He was here. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, erratic beat that drowned out everything else. I should have pretended to sleep, should have stayed still and let him leave. But my body betrayed me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door, and there he was. Damon stood framed in the threshold, his jacket gone, his tie loosened, the top buttons of his shirt undone. The dim light cast shadows across his sharp features, but his eyes, they burned dark, unrelenting. They pinned me in place, stripping away any pretense of calm I'd tried to cling to. For the first time that night, I felt truly seen. The air in the room thickened as Damon stood there, his silhouette filling the doorway. My fingers clutched the sheets, the fabric wrinkling under my grip as my pulse thundered in my ears. He didn't move, not yet, but his presence alone was enough to shift everything. The cold, detached man from the altar was gone, replaced by something else, something darker, something that made my skin prickle with awareness. He stepped forward, each footfall a quiet echo against the marble floor. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between fear and a strange, unbidden thrill. He'd shed the formality of the day, his jacket discarded, his tie hanging loose. The white shirt slightly rumpled, revealing a sliver of collarbone that somehow made him look less untouchable, more human. And yet, those eyes, they were anything but. They locked onto me, intense and unyielding, stripping away the walls I tried to build in the last few hours. I should have spoken. Should have demanded to know why he was here after dismissing me so coldly. But my throat was dry, my tongue useless. He stopped at the edge of the bed, too close now, his shadow falling over me. The scent of him, woodsy, warm, with a faint trace of whiskey, drifted into my space, intoxicating and dangerous. My body tensed, every nerve on high alert as he towered above me. "You should be asleep," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel rolling over silk. There was something in his tone I couldn't place, something that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "So should you." The words slipped out before I could stop them, a weak attempt at defiance. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. Then the corner of his mouth twitched, just a hint of a smile. But there was no humor in it. It was sharp, predatory, like a wolf baring its teeth. He tilted his head, his dark eyes sweeping over my face, lingering on my lips, my flushed cheeks, the way my chest rose and fell too quickly beneath the thin satin of my slip. He leaned closer, bracing one hand on the headboard. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight, and I felt the heat radiating from him, so near, I could almost taste it. His breath brushed my ear, a whisper of warmth that made my entire body lock up. I couldn't move, couldn't think, not with him this close, not with the air crackling like a storm about to break. "But how the hell do you expect me to sleep?" he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "When you know you belong to me now?" My heart stopped. The world tilted, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. "You belong to me now." The words sank into me, heavy and possessive, igniting a fire I didn't know I had. I should have pushed back. Should have told him I belonged to no one, least of all him. But I couldn't. My lips parted, but no sound came out. I was trapped, pinned, not by his hands, but by the weight of his gaze, the certainty in his tone. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes searching mine. He was studying me again, cataloging every flicker of emotion that crossed my face. The way my breath stuttered, the way my fingers tightened on the sheets, and he liked it. I could see it in the faint curve of his lips, the way his pupils darkened. He thrived on this, on my uncertainty, my struggle, the silent battle raging inside me. "You're nervous," he said, his voice a slow, sinful drawl that amused me. My mouth opened, a protest forming, but nothing came. He was right. I was nervous, unraveling under the intensity of his attention, and he knew it. Worse, he enjoyed it. Before I could find my voice, his hand moved quick, decisive. His fingers closed around my wrist, warm and firm, and in one fluid motion, he pulled me to my feet. I gasped, stumbling forward. My body collided with his. My hands instinctively flew to his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his shirt as heat seared through me where we touched. His chest was solid, unyielding, and I could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my palms, calm, controlled, the opposite of mine. My own pulse raced, erratic and wild, as I stared up at him, caught in the storm of his gaze. "What are you doing?" My voice trembled, betraying me, and I hated how fragile I sounded. He didn't flinch. His eyes bored into mine, deep and unrelenting, a look that made my stomach drop and my knees weak. "Doing what you've been waiting for me to do," he said, his tone dark and certain. Then, in a single swift step, he backed me against the wall. The air rushed out of my lungs as my spine hit the cool surface. His body was too close now, caging me in. One hand planted beside my head, the other still gripping my wrist. He was heat and strength and raw, overwhelming presence, filling every inch of my senses. I trembled, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. But it wasn't fear coursing through me. It was something far more dangerous, anticipation. I'd never been this close to a man before, never felt the weight of someone's touch like this. My skin burned where his fingers pressed against my wrist, a delicious ache spreading through me. I was untouched, untested, a blank slate in a world I'd only ever imagined. And now here he was, Damon Carter, the man who'd claimed me without asking, the man whose indifference had crumbled into something primal, something I couldn't escape. His eyes traced every detail of me, the quick rise and fall of my chest, the parting of my lips, the way my fingers twitched against his shoulders. He saw it all, drank it in, and I couldn't hide a thing. "Tell me, Elizabeth," he whispered, his lips hovering dangerously close to my ear. His voice was a velvet blade cutting through what little resolve I had left. "Do you want me to stop?" I should have said yes. It was the rational choice, the safe one. I should have pushed him away, reclaimed the space he'd stolen. But my silence stretched on 1 second too long, and that was all he needed. His smile was devastating, slow, wicked, triumphant. "That's what I thought," he said. The world seemed to freeze as Damon's words sank in. His breath still warm against my ear. Time didn't just slow, it stopped altogether, leaving me suspended in the heat of his gaze, the press of his body against mine. He didn't move, didn't blink. His hand still firm around my wrist, not tight enough to hurt but possessive enough to make my heart stutter. It was a test, a dare, as if he were waiting for me to pull away, to give him the satisfaction of dragging me back. My chest heaved, each breath shallow and quick, betraying the chaos inside me. I needed to speak, to break this spell, to reclaim some sliver of control. But my voice was trapped, buried beneath the weight of his presence. All I could do was stare into those dark eyes, eyes that had gone from cold indifference to something molten, something that devoured every flicker of my reaction. And that was my mistake, looking at him. Because the moment I did, his gaze darkened further, a shadow passing over his features that told me one undeniable truth: he wasn't letting go. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Damon," my voice was a whisper, barely audible, a plea I didn't even understand myself. He didn't answer, not with words. His eyes roamed my face, mapping every tremble, every flush, as if he were committing me to memory. He liked this. Liked watching me unravel, liked knowing he was the cause. I should have hated him for it. I should have despised the way he toyed with me, the way he wielded his power like a weapon. But the truth, the shameful, burning truth, was that I didn't. My body hummed with a need I couldn't name, a longing that defied every rational thought screaming in my head. The silence between us grew taut, electric, a thread stretched to its breaking point. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the haze like a blade. "I never wanted this marriage." My breath locked in my chest, a sharp ache twisting through me. I knew that already. Knew it from the moment I'd walked down that aisle, from the way he'd stood at the altar like a statue carved from ice. But hearing it now, so raw and unfiltered, stung deeper than I'd expected. "I know," I managed, my voice fragile but steady. He tilted his head, his face inching closer until his lips hovered near my ear. His next words shattered every illusion I'd clung to. "But now I do." The world spun, my stomach plummeted, and my body went rigid, caught in the gravity of what he just confessed. Damon Carter. Ruthless, untouchable. Damon Carter wanted me, not the arrangement, not the contract, but me. The realization hit like a tidal wave, drowning out the noise in my mind. He wasn't playing a game anymore. This was real. This was him staking a claim, and I knew he never said anything he didn't mean. The air around us thickened, charged with something wild and untamed. He wasn't the man who'd ignored me at the altar, the CEO who'd signed our lives away without a second glance. He was something else now, something that burned, something that consumed. And my traitorous body responded, heat pooling low in my belly, my skin tingling where his fingers still held my wrist. My mind screamed at me to resist, to push him away, to cling to the last threads of my independence. But my body had already surrendered. Leaning into the warmth of him, craving the contact I'd never known I needed. He must have seen it, the shift in my eyes, the way my resistance faltered. Because when he spoke again, his voice was a low, commanding rumble that sealed my fate. "You're mine now, Elizabeth." My heart slammed against my ribs, a desperate, erratic beat. I could have run. I could have denied it, lied to myself and to him. But I was already lost. Lost in the depth of his stare, the certainty of his touch, the promise in his words. He'd won, and I hadn't even realized we'd been playing until it was too late. His hand slid from my wrist to my waist, pulling me closer. His fingers pressed into the soft fabric of my slip. The roughness of his palm against the satin sent a jolt through me, and I gasped, my hands flattening against his chest. He was solid, unyielding, a wall of heat and power that I couldn't escape. Not that I wanted to anymore. I thought I had control. I thought I could walk away from this night unscathed, dictate how it ended. But I'd been wrong, so wrong. The man who'd stood so coldly at the altar, who treated me like an afterthought, had flipped the script entirely. Now, I was the one caught, the one trembling under his touch, the one who couldn't look away. And as his forehead brushed mine, a ragged breath escaping him, I understood something else. This wasn't just about me. He was unraveling too, his composure cracking, his walls crumbling. The man who never bent for anyone was ending now, for me. "Damon," I whispered again, softer this time, a question and a surrender all at once. He didn't respond with words. Instead, his hand tightened on my waist, pulling me flush against him. His other hand slid up, cupping the back of my neck. His thumb brushed the sensitive skin there. My breath hitched, my body igniting under his touch. I was still innocent, untouched by anyone before him, and the intensity of it, the raw, unfamiliar desire, overwhelmed me. And if you're caught up in this moment as I am, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that button now so you don't miss what happens next between Elizabeth and Damon. The space between us vanished as Damon's grip tightened, his fingers digging into my waist with a possessive edge that sent shivers racing across my skin. His thumb traced slow, deliberate circles against the nape of my neck, each touch a spark that ignited something deep within me. My breath came in shallow gasps. My hands pressed against his chest, feeling the hard planes of muscle beneath his shirt. He was a force, unrelenting, overwhelming, and I was caught in his orbit, unable to pull away even if I wanted to. And I didn't want to. Not anymore. His words still echoed in my mind. "You're mine now, Elizabeth." A declaration that had shifted everything. The man who'd stood so distant at the altar, who treated this marriage like a business deal, was now unraveling before me. His forehead pressed against mine, his breath ragged, warm, and laced with the faintest hint of whiskey. It was the first crack I'd seen in his armor, the first sign that Damon Carter wasn't as invincible as he seemed. But it wasn't just him. I was breaking too, shattering under the weight of my own desire, a longing I'd never known until this moment. My innocence, my inexperience, only heightened it all. I'd never been touched like this. Never felt a man's hands on me. Never known the heat that now coursed through my veins. And yet, with him, it didn't feel foreign. It felt inevitable. His lips hovered near mine, so close I could almost taste him. My heart pounded, a wild, desperate rhythm that matched the chaos in my head. I should have been afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of this. Afraid of the unknown stretching out before me. But fear had melted away, replaced by a hunger that burned brighter with every second he held me. Then he moved. His hand slid from my neck to my jaw, tilting my face up as his lips brushed mine. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just a tease. A whisper of contact that made my knees buckle. I clutched his shirt tighter, anchoring myself as my body trembled against his. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark and blazing, searching mine for any sign of retreat. He wouldn't find it. Not now. The tension snapped. His mouth crashed against mine, fierce and claiming, and I gasped into the kiss, my senses exploding. It wasn't gentle. It was raw. Urgent. A collision of need and restraint finally breaking free. His hands roamed, one sliding down my back to pull me closer, the other tangling in my hair. I melted into him, my inexperience forgotten as instinct took over, my lips moving against his with a fervor I didn't know I possessed. He deepened the kiss, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he pressed me harder against the wall. My skin burned where he touched me, the satin slipping, doing little to shield me from the heat of his hands. And then he lifted me, effortless and swift, my legs wrapping around his waist without thought. I was weightless. Consumed. Lost in the storm of him. The first time was a revelation. He took me with a tenderness that surprised me, his movements slow and deliberate as he discovered my innocence, my untouched body yielding to him in a way that left us both breathless. He paused, his eyes widening briefly, a flicker of something softer breaking through the intensity. But the second time, the restraint was gone. He was voracious, hungry, claiming me with a ferocity that made my head spin, as if I were the sustenance he'd craved for far too long. My body responded, arching into him, craving more, even as I struggled to keep up with the tidal wave of sensation. By the third time, I was someone else. Someone bold. Unrestrained. A woman I didn't recognize. I touched him without hesitation, my hands exploring the contours of his body, reveling in the way he shuddered under my fingers. I offered myself fully, every inch of me his to claim. And the pleasure that followed was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Intense. Consuming. Shattering me into a million pieces, only to rebuild me in his arms. That night stretched on, a blur of tangled sheets and whispered breaths, our bodies finding each other again and again. I thought I'd be the one surrendering. But as the hours passed, I realized the truth. I held the power. Every gasp he drew from me, every time he lost himself in me, I was the one in control. He might have claimed me. But I'd claimed him too. And it didn't end there. Our marriage, once a cold arrangement, became something else. Something alive. Something real. In the days and nights that followed, we found each other. Not just in the bedroom. But beyond it. Building a happiness I'd never dared to dream of. I'd spent my life thinking belonging to someone was a cage. But with Damon, it was freedom. He'd fallen first, kneeling before me that night with desire in his eyes. And I'd followed, tumbling into a love I hadn't seen coming. The man who'd ignored me at the altar was now the one who couldn't live without me. And I couldn't live without him. As I lay there in the aftermath, his arm draped over me, his breathing steady and deep, I knew one thing for certain. I was his. And he was mine. Forever.